Berlin, April 1945. The Reich is collapsing under the weight of Soviet artillery and Allied bombs. Hitler is sealed in his bunker beneath the Chancellery, issuing orders to armies that no longer exist. Above ground, the city is fragmenting into chaos. SS units execute deserters in the streets. Civilians flee west with whatever they can carry. And in the basement offices of the Reichssicherheitshotamt, the Reich Main Security Office, on Prinz Albrechtstrasse, clerks are burning files by the thousands, feeding decades of documentation into roaring incinerators that turn history into ash. Among those files, one is being handled differently. It belongs to an SS officer known in operational records only as Sturmbannführer Hartman, assigned to AMT-6, foreign intelligence operations under Walter Schellenberg. No first name appears in accessible documents. No photograph survives in personnel archives. Just a rank, a code name used in internal communications, and a record of assignments across occupied Eastern Europe from 1941 through early 1945. On April 22, 1945, with Soviet forces entering Berlin's outskirts and artillery shells falling on the city center, Hartman is seen leaving the Reich Main Security Office, carrying a leather briefcase and a small valise. Multiple witnesses later testified to his departure during post-war investigations. Some remember him in SS uniform, the lightning bolt insignia still visible on his collar. Others recall civilian clothes, a gray suit and overcoat. All agree he walked west, away from the Soviet advance, moving with purpose rather than the panic that gripped most of the city. That was the last confirmed sighting by German witnesses. But Allied records tell a different story, or rather, fragments of several different stories that don't quite align. On April 28, 1945, an American counterintelligence corps unit operating near the Elbe River files a brief report noting the reception of SS intelligence officer claiming to possess materials regarding Soviet intelligence operations and willing to provide cooperation. No name is given, just a notation that the subject is being transferred to higher authority for evaluation, and that his materials appear potentially valuable. On May 3rd, a British intelligence officer sends a coded message to London mentioning German intelligence officer, formerly SS AMT-6, currently providing detailed briefing on Soviet intelligence structures and operational methods. Subject cooperating fully. Intelligence value confirmed through independent verification. On May 10, 1945, 2 days after Germany's surrender, an American OSS memo discusses former enemy intelligence personnel with extensive knowledge of Soviet methods, currently under protection pending determination of intelligence value and security classification. And then silence. In the denazification proceedings and war crimes investigations that followed, thousands of SS officers were arrested, interrogated, prosecuted. Those from the Reich Main Security Office faced particular scrutiny. Their roles in intelligence operations and occupation policies in the machinery of persecution made them priority targets for Allied justice. But Sturmbannführer Hartman appeared on no arrest lists, no wanted bulletins, no war crimes investigation files. For someone with his rank and organizational affiliation, the absence was extraordinary, and it will remain unexplained for 81 years. AMT-6 of the Reichssicherheitshotamt was responsible for foreign intelligence operations. Under Walter Schellenberg, it conducted espionage against Allied powers, managed agents in neutral countries, and gathered intelligence on Soviet military and political structures. Officers assigned to AMT-6 were not foot soldiers. They were intelligence specialists, linguists, analysts, the kind of men whose knowledge would be valuable to whoever won the war, whose expertise transcended ideology. Sturmbannführer Hartman's operational record, pieced together decades later from fragmentary SS documents captured by Allied forces and scattered across multiple archives, shows assignment to Section 6C, which focused on Soviet intelligence operations. His postings included Warsaw in 1941, during the initial phase of German occupation, Minsk in 1942, as the Wehrmacht advanced deeper into Soviet territory, Smolensk in 1943, as the front line stabilized and then began their slow, grinding reversal. Each assignment coincided with German occupation of territories where intelligence gathering on Soviet partisan networks, NKVD operations, and Red Army capabilities was critical to the war effort. By early 1944, as German forces retreated across Eastern Europe, Hartman was recalled to Berlin for analytical work at headquarters, producing assessments of Soviet intelligence capabilities and vulnerabilities in German communication security. Desk work, but work that required intimate knowledge of both German and Soviet intelligence methods, of how both sides gathered information, protected sources, and exploited weaknesses. A personnel evaluation from January 1945, discovered in fragmentary SS archives held in federal German repositories, described him as technically proficient in Soviet intelligence analysis, politically reliable but not ideologically zealous, operationally valuable despite limited party commitment. Politically reliable but not ideologically zealous. The phrase appeared frequently in evaluations of technical specialists whose value lay in expertise rather than Nazi ideology. Men who served the Reich without necessarily believing in its racial theories or territorial ambitions. In early April 1945, as Allied forces closed on Berlin from all directions and the Reich's final collapse became inevitable, Hartman remained at his post, coordinating the evacuation and destruction of sensitive intelligence materials. SS administrative records show his signature on documents authorizing the transfer of files to secure locations and the destruction of operational records that could not be evacuated in the final chaotic weeks. On April 20th, Hitler's last birthday, celebrated in the bunker with grim ceremony. A transport manifest shows Hartman departing Berlin with other intelligence personnel being evacuated south toward Bavaria. The manifest lists departure but no arrival destination, routine for the chaos of late April when records were fragmentary and destinations uncertain. His next documented appearance was April 28, in American custody near the Elbe River. The gap was 8 days. Where he spent that time, how he crossed from Berlin through Germany in its death throes, what materials he carried with him in that leather briefcase. None of that was recorded in his brief processing report or in any accessible Allied documents. When American forces compiled lists of SS intelligence personnel for war crimes investigation and technical interrogation, Hartman's name should have appeared prominently. Men in his position, with his background, with his knowledge of Soviet intelligence operations, were exactly what Allied services needed as the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union dissolved into Cold War suspicion and competition. If you are enjoying this story, please subscribe to support the channel. But he was never interrogated through normal channels. No standard debriefing record exists in captured personnel files. No transfer to specialized facilities where captured SS intelligence personnel were being systematically questioned about Nazi espionage methods and Soviet intelligence capabilities. No flag and occupation authority files indicating his detention or processing through denazification procedures. In July 1945, Soviet authorities requested information from Western allies about former SS AMT-6 personnel who had specialized in anti-Soviet intelligence operations. They were particularly interested in officers who had served in occupied Soviet territories and might have committed crimes against civilians or prisoners of war, or who possessed knowledge of German intelligence methods that might inform Soviet counterintelligence operations. Hartman's name was on their list, flagged as having served in Minsk and Smolensk during the occupation. The American response, delivered through official military government channels, stated, Subject Hartman, former SS Sturmbannführer, no information available, not in U.S. custody, no record detention or processing. The British response was identical in substance. No information regarding Subject Hartman, not detained by British forces, no record in war crimes files. The Soviets, unsatisfied with these responses, pressed further through diplomatic channels. They had found references to Hartman in captured German documents from occupied Soviet territories, references to intelligence operations that had led to partisan arrests and executions. They wanted to interview him about his role, about what he knew, about what he had done. The Western responses did not change. No information, not in custody. No records available for review. In 1947, the U.S. Army's Counterintelligence Corps compiled a comprehensive study of German intelligence operations against the Soviet Union, drawing heavily on interrogations of captured SS and Abwehr personnel and on seized documents. Dozens of former German intelligence officers were interviewed over months. Their knowledge systematically extracted and documented in technical reports that would inform American intelligence operations for years. Hartman's name appeared in the study's source notes as someone whose position and experience suggested he should have been interviewed for the project. But there was no interrogation record, no technical report, no indication he had provided information through normal intelligence exploitation channels. A researcher working on the study filed an internal inquiry about the absence, noting the gap in coverage of SSAMT-6 Soviet operations. The response, preserved in declassified project files, stated, "Subject Hartman handled through separate arrangement. No additional information available to this project." Separate arrangement. The phrase suggested something outside standard procedures, some process that existed beyond the normal exploitation of captured enemy intelligence personnel. Through the 1950s and 1960s, historians researching SS intelligence operations occasionally encounter Hartman's name in captured organizational charts and operational reports. He appeared in communication logs, in after-action summaries, in personnel rosters showing the structure of AMT-6 and its various sections. Always in technical context, always in positions suggesting significant knowledge of Soviet intelligence methods and German operations in occupied territories. But there was never any information about what happened to him after April 1945. Reference works on SS personnel listed him as fate unknown, presumed killed Berlin April 1945, or died in captivity. Academic studies of Nazi intelligence mention him only in passing, if at all, as one of many mid-level officers whose post-war fate remained undocumented. The silence was systematic, too complete to be accidental. Files that should have existed didn't. Records that should have documented his interrogation or prosecution were absent from multiple archives, and inquiries about him were met with consistent responses across different repositories. No information available. Records lost during the chaos of 1945. Fate unknown. It was the kind of silence that required coordination across institutional boundaries and national archives, maintenance through generations of archivists and intelligence officers, the kind that suggested not forgetting but active, deliberate management. Dr. Hans Weber was researching Allied exploitation of German intelligence personnel after World War II, focusing on how captured enemy expertise informed Western intelligence operations during the early Cold War. A historian at Humboldt University in Berlin, Weber had spent years working through declassified CIA, MI6, and German federal archives, trying to understand the transfer of knowledge from defeated enemy to victorious powers. In 2023, while reviewing recently released CIA files from the late 1940s, part of a routine declassification cycle that released materials after 75 years, he found something unexpected. It was an internal memo from 1949 discussing the security classification of former enemy intelligence personnel currently or previously employed in advisory capacity. The memo listed criteria for maintaining classification: ongoing operational value, potential diplomatic complications with former allies, protection of intelligence sources and methods, standard bureaucratic language for sensitive programs that involve former enemies. Attached was a roster case file reference numbers corresponding to specific individuals. Most were completely redacted, blacked out entirely. But one entry was partially visible, the ink having faded slightly over decades. Case 45 Gray. Subject: Hartman SSAMT-6. Status: employed 1945 to 1948. Classification: protected. Current status: resettled per agreement. Identity protection: permanent. The memo was dated 1949. For years after the war ended, Hartman hadn't died in Berlin or been prosecuted for war crimes. He had been employed by American intelligence for at least 3 years. Weber requested the full Gray case file through Freedom of Information Act channels. The response came months later. Requested materials remain classified under National Security Exemption 50 U.S.C. 3024-I. Intelligence sources and methods. Access denied. He tried different approaches, searching for cross-references in other archives. In a 1946 Army intelligence budget document, partially declassified in 2018, he found a line item for technical consultants, Soviet intelligence analysis with notation, gray arrangement continuation, specialized knowledge, NKVD operations, annual cost $15,000. In a 1948 CIA memo discussing security protocols for former enemy personnel working with U.S. intelligence, there was a paragraph about subject employed since April 1945, extensive knowledge of Soviet intelligence methods and organizational structures, identity protection maintained per original recruitment agreement, clearance level secret. None of these documents named Hartman explicitly, but the case number, the specialty, and the timeline all aligned perfectly. He had been employed immediately after the war, worked for at least 3 years on American intelligence projects, possibly longer. The breakthrough came from British archives. In 2024, MI6 released a batch of files from the immediate post-war period, materials that had been held under extended classification due to their intelligence sensitivity. Among them was a 1945 memo from British intelligence to their American counterparts discussing coordination regarding employment of former German intelligence personnel with specialized Soviet knowledge. One paragraph read, "Regarding Gray, Sturmbannführer Hartman, former SSAMT-6, British services concur with American arrangement for technical employment. Subject provided valuable debriefing April-May 1945 regarding German intelligence on Soviet operations, NKVD organizational structures, and Soviet partisan networks in occupied territories. Information verified through independent sources and assessed as operationally valuable. Recommend continued employment and identity protection given sensitivity of recruitment circumstances and potential Soviet interest in subject." April-May 1945, the weeks between his disappearance from Berlin and Germany's official surrender. He hadn't been fleeing capture or hiding from prosecution. He had been in Allied custody, providing technical debriefing on German intelligence operations, establishing his value, negotiating the terms of his protection. When he was reported as not in custody to Soviet authorities in July 1945, it wasn't an administrative error or missing information. It was a deliberate falsehood. He was in Western custody. He was being employed, and that employment was being actively concealed from Soviet allies who wanted to prosecute him for his wartime activities. Weber found confirmation in a Soviet intelligence report obtained by Western services during the Cold War through defector and partially declassified in 2021. It discussed German intelligence officers suspected of providing cooperation to Western allies in exchange for protection from prosecution. One entry mentioned says officer, AMT-6 Soviet section, believed to have entered American custody April 1945, employed in intelligence analysis regarding Soviet capabilities, identity protected under classified arrangement, suspected provision of intelligence regarding Soviet partisan networks and NKVD operational methods in occupied territories. But crucial questions remained unanswered, protected by classification barriers that showed no sign of ever coming down. What specific intelligence had Hartman provided that made him valuable enough to protect? What operations had he participated in during the war in occupied Soviet territories that might have warranted prosecution? What had his work in Minsk and Smolensk involved? And most importantly, who was he really? What was his actual name? Weber filed formal requests for declassification of Hartman's real identity and full operational file. The responses from American, British, and German intelligence agencies were nearly identical. Materials related to Gray operation remained classified under national security exemptions, sensitive sources, and methods. No declassification authorized at this time. He found one final piece of evidence in a 2025 NSA release of historical materials. A 1972 memo discussing former enemy intelligence personnel whose wartime service and post-war employment remain classified. One entry mentioned Gray, employed 1945 to 1965, extensive service on Soviet analysis projects resettled redacted, under protected identity 1965, monthly pension authorized, identity protection maintained per 1945 security determination. Hartman had worked for American intelligence for 20 years after the war ended. He had then been resettled somewhere under a protected identity that remained classified 81 years later, his real name still hidden, his post-war life still sealed behind bureaucratic barriers. The truth about Sturmbannführer Hartman is no longer completely hidden. It exists in fragmentary declassified documents, in cross-references scattered across multiple archives, in the gaps where information should be but isn't. He was an SS intelligence officer who provided cooperation to American services in April 1945. He was employed for 20 years working on Soviet intelligence analysis projects. He was resettled in 1965 under a new identity that remains classified. His real name, his specific wartime activities, his post-war life, all remain sealed behind classification barriers. In 2025, a retired CIA officer, speaking anonymously to a journalist researching cold war intelligence operations, said something revealing. The Hartman case is typical of decisions made in 1945 when we suddenly realized the Soviets were going to be our next enemy. He was SS. He probably participated in operations in occupied Soviet territory that would have warranted prosecution if we'd turned him over. But he had knowledge we desperately needed about Soviet intelligence capabilities and methods. Someone decided what he knew was worth more than what he'd done. That decision was then protected, classified, maintained for 80 years. Because how do you publicly acknowledge employing an SS officer while simultaneously prosecuting others at Nuremberg? You don't. You seal it permanently. Weber's research revealed something beyond Hartman's individual story. In the declassified documents, he found references to similar case files with similar code names: gray, silver, iron, steel. Each was described as former SS/SD intelligence personnel employed for Soviet analysis, identity protected under permanent classification. Each file remained classified. Each identity remained sealed. Each case suggested not an individual exception, but a systematic program of recruiting German intelligence personnel with Soviet expertise. In early 2026, Weber received an anonymous email through an encrypted service. The message was brief: "You found Gray. Ask why his identity is still classified when everyone involved is dead. Ask what he did in occupied Soviet territories that would have warranted prosecution. Ask how many people would object to his employment if they knew his real name." The classification isn't protecting intelligence methods anymore. It's protecting a decision no one wants to defend publicly. 81 years after Sturmbannführer Hartman walked out of the Reich main security office and disappeared into Allied protection, his story is partially known. He was an SS intelligence officer who cooperated with American services from April 1945. He was employed for 20 years on intelligence projects. He was resettled under an identity that remains hidden. But the full truth remains locked behind classification barriers maintained by institutions that decided his knowledge was more valuable than justice, that what he could reveal about Soviet intelligence was worth protecting him from prosecution for whatever he had done during the war. The files exist. They sit in archives, marked with classifications that have never expired, protected by decisions made 81 years ago about what truths were too complicated to acknowledge. Because Hartman's story isn't just about one man's immunity from prosecution. It's about calculations made about acceptable compromises, about how intelligence advantage was valued against accountability for crimes, about whether those calculations can ever be publicly acknowledged without undermining the moral authority that justified the war itself. The streets of Berlin are rebuilt now. The ruins of 1945 replaced by modern buildings and memorials. The Reich main security office on Prinz Albrechtstrasse is gone, demolished, replaced by a documentation center about Nazi crimes and their victims. No plaque marks what happened there in April 1945, who walked out carrying secrets and vanished into protection. History records the prosecutions at Nuremberg, the tribunals, the accounting for crimes. But the ones who were protected, whose knowledge was valued over accountability, whose identities were sealed to protect not just them, but the decisions made about them, those remain hidden behind barriers that may never fall. Sturmbannführer Hartman's identity was classified until now. 81 years later, we know what he did, but not who he was, not who he became, not his real name, or where he lived, or when he died. The truth hit hard, but only the part of the truth they decided we could know. If you like this story, please subscribe to support this channel.